Thank you so much, Beverly, for opening us up in that way, and welcome everyone. We're going to begin our conversation with Dr. Hagre offering words of welcome to us.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Hagre, and I'm Executive Director of American Baptist Home Mission Societies and CEO of Judson Press. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm so thankful that for those of you who've joined the call and others will be joining us as we go. Here at ABHMS, we launched the Justice Dialogues in 2020 in consideration of all that was going on in our larger world and continues to be unfolding. Among them, the pandemic, which exposed so many of the fault lines in our society with regard to racialized policing, the mass criminalization, the economic and health disparities, educational disparities. Also, we witnessed in 2020 the huge political polarization, climaxing with the insurrection in January, on January 6th of 2021. And we see the ongoing insurrection with regard to the issue of voter suppression and gerrymandering, which is for me a form of insurrection insofar as it really threatens the health of our democracy. And so we convene these dialogues because we're aware then still are, that many of you on this call and many of our partners in American Baptist life and beyond American Baptist orbit, we're working tirelessly on a daily basis, motivated by your faith to make an impact in your local communities, some on behalf of your church and through your employment, but others of you with no particular employment portfolio or income to account for the work that you're doing. You're just working quietly, faithfully on a daily basis in your local communities, in your church, through your job and elsewhere. And we felt that we wanted to create a safe space for those who are committed to the work of justice and making an impact in the world. We wanted to create a space where you can come and meet other like-minded persons of faith who are moved to make a tangible and concrete difference in the world. Talk about your experiences, discover who's doing what and where, how they're going about it, and perhaps expand your own network of persons who perhaps have similar passions and commitment as you do, but who you simply did not know. And without the benefit of this space, you would not meet this particular collection of people and hear their voices and learn about their stories. So as the needs continue, the need for the justice dialogues continue. So I'm very excited today. Our speaker, who is one of us, he is an American Baptist. Lisa will say more about Adam. I won't even start, Adam, to talk about you, because otherwise there'll be no need for her to introduce you, because we go way back. But thankful to all of you for being here today, and I hope we have a great experience in our time together today. Thank you so much.
Appreciate those comments and words of welcome, Jeff, and we'll only echo particularly the part about creating a safe space for us to gather, to tell our stories, to receive encouragement, to offer prayer and provide updates so that we can be fortified in our work together. So in this moment, I want to invite you to just take a moment and scroll among the names and faces that you see at the table. Presently, we have 34 people who were gathered. We have over 50 who have registered, so I'm anticipating others will join us as they can. But these are our colleagues who are seeking a more just society with you. You are not alone in your effort to be the change that you seek in your communities, to facilitate the changes that you believe line up with God's vision for our communities. And as Christians and as citizens of the United States who are striving to live and love and lead like Jesus Christ, we are called to pay attention to the realities in which we live and serve. And one of these realities is that the democracy in which we live and serve is struggling to operate with integrity for all citizens, for all people. And so we come together to discuss why this should matter to Christians. And after we pray together, I'm going to invite another colleague, Curtis Ramsey Lucas, who's also who goes way back with Adam Taylor. Curtis is going to actually introduce Adam to us, and so Adam is one who we're grateful has answered God's call in his life, cares about people, and stands and serves at the intersection of faith and justice with us. So community, let us pray. And I'm pulling this prayer from Anne Weems in her reflections, Searching for Shalom. And so she offers a prayer that she calls a confession, and with a little variation on it, I think it serves us well today in centering us. Let us pray. Oh God, we confess that at times we forget who we are. We don't listen for a still small voice. We walk with our heads down and miss all the stars that could be ours. But we know, oh God, that you are a God of hope who does not forget your covenant with us. Oh God, help us remember who you are, a God of hope, a God who is a shepherd who looks for lost sheep, a faithful God who keeps calling us in spite of our lack of listening. A God who enters our history and opens our eyes and heals our blindness. Oh God, help us remember who you are calling us to be. You call us as your stewards and send us out to be your hope and love in the world. Help us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Curtis.
Reverend Adam Russell Taylor is president of Sojourners and author of A More Perfect Union, a new vision for building the beloved community. Previously, he led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group and served as the vice president in charge of advocacy at World Vision US and as the senior political director at Sojourners. He's a graduate of Emory University, the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. Reverend Taylor is ordained in the American Baptist Churches USA and the Progressive National Baptist Convention, and serves in ministry at the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. In his new book, Reverend Taylor argues that America is at a crossroads and that a new public narrative is needed to unite Americans around common values and to counter the increasing discord and acrimony in our politics and culture. He suggests that the process of healing and creating a more perfect union in our nation must start now, and that the moral vision of Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community, which animated and galvanized the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, provides a hopeful way forward. In A More Perfect Union, Reverend Taylor articulates a contemporary vision of the beloved community to inspire and unite Americans across generations, geographic and class divides, racial and gender differences, faith traditions, and ideological leanings. In this vision, neither privilege nor punishment is tied to race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or economic status, and all are able to realize their full potential and thrive. By building the beloved community, Reverend Taylor suggests we unify the country around a shared moral vision that transcends ideology and partisanship, tapping into our most sacred civic and religious values, enabling our nation to live up to its best ideals and realize a more perfect union. Adam Taylor is a friend of the American Baptist Home Mission Societies. We are delighted to have him with us today as he sets the table for our discussion on the role of Christians in rebuilding America's democracy. it is my pleasure to welcome to the Justice Dialogues, Adam Taylor. Adam.
Thank you, Curtis, for such a kind introduction. I feel like you did an amazing job summarizing my book. I'm gonna have to bring you on more often in future events. I want to thank Reverend Lisa and Jeff, Reverend Hagray, dear friends, and Jeff is my former pastor. It's just so good to be back in this family, and I really treasure the American Baptist Home Mission Society and the American Baptist Church. I'm going to frame a little bit both why I think we are facing one of the most grave threats and assaults on our democracy, really since the height of the civil rights struggle, and maybe even more grave than before that struggle. But I also want to offer a word of hope and encouragement, because I believe that we have so much agency and power to be able to, what I describe in a chapter of my book, which Curtis just summarized, A More Perfect Union, to reinvent and to revitalize our democracy. And I really believe that that is a test of Christian discipleship, that this charge, this responsibility to safeguard our democracy, to protect the right to vote, is part and parcel to what Christian discipleship requires and is all about. So I'll get into that in a second, but first I want to share a little bit from my own story, because it, I think, helps to frame a little bit what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So I'm going to age myself a little bit. I come out of Generation X, and my parents, my Black mother, my white father, made the controversial decision to marry each other in 1968. Now, this was a tragic turning point in our nation's history, as many of you know, the year that Dr. King was assassinated, as was Robert F. Kennedy. And really could be argued was the moment when the civil rights movement really started to lose momentum and even imploded. They instilled in me a deep and abiding belief that not only did my generation, Generation X, inherit the unfinished business of the civil rights movement, but that my diversity, in a larger sense, our nation's diversity, was a gift and not a threat, was an asset and not a liability, was a strength and not a weakness. And I would argue that one of the undercurrents, one of the fault lines in our politics, which has certainly been with us from the beginning, of America's original sin of slavery and racism, is still with us today in a new mutated form. And that this kind of anxiety and fear that, unfortunately, sadly, so many of our brothers and sisters, particularly within predominantly white churches or within the white community, have about the changing demographics in this country, where by 2043, we will be a country in which whites are going to be in minority. Now, I think that should be a source of great pride and hope and joy. But unfortunately, particularly given some of the politics and the polarization in our nation, that has been spun as a source of great fear and trepidation. And it certainly was kind of an undercurrent in the 2016 election, but even in the 2020 election. I think it's important to kind of situate this conversation historically. When our founders 244 years ago signed the Constitution that promised one person, one vote, at the beginning of our nation, voting was constrained, was limited to just white land-holding males, literally about 10% of the American population. Women were excluded, Black slaves were excluded, anyone who wasn't white and wasn't landowning was excluded. And so in this ongoing journey of trying to strive to become a more perfect union, and in this ongoing journey of trying to expand who we the people actually includes, we know that voting has been a contested issue from the very beginning. And so in some ways, it's not surprising that it still remains contested today. Now, I have to admit, I never thought that the right to vote would be a part of that unfinished business of the civil rights movement. I took for granted when I was young, and even when I was in college, that the right to vote was secure, that we had to focus on economic justice issues and addressing racial injustice in our criminal justice system and address mass incarceration. But I couldn't imagine that the right to vote itself would become so imperiled. Now, we know that this threat or these attacks on the right to vote didn't come out of a vacuum. In many ways, they started in the year 2000 during another contentious election when then candidate Vice President Al Gore ended up conceding the election. But before he conceded, there was a moment in Florida that you all probably remember where there was a big fight over the counting of votes in Dade County, Miami-Dade County. And there was a group of Republican operatives that descended upon the courts at a moment when it was uncertain what was going to happen and what the courts would ultimately rule. Well, really, from that point forward, there has been a concerted strategy, particularly within many parts of the Republican Party, to try to make this case that there is widespread voter fraud in our election system, often without an iota of evidence. And I just want to give a disclaimer here. I'm going to try to be very careful not to be partisan. I believe that, building on the words of Dr. King, the church is called to be the conscience of the state, never the master or the servant of the state. But I also believe in the importance of truth-telling. And in the case of voter suppression, in the case of many of the forces that are undermining our democracy, we have to be very truthful about who is driving so much of this effort and be really clear about why. And so if you kind of fast forward to 2013 through the Citizens United, first the Citizens United case, which really opened up the floodgates, enabling big money to pour in our election system without much control or many limits. And then you fast forward to a critical case that really helped to undermine and to gut the Voting Rights Act, one of the signature achievements of the civil rights movement. This was in 2013. It's the Shelby County versus Holder case. That case literally struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act that required many states, particularly in the South, because of the long history of Jim Crow segregation and the many barriers that are erected to prevent Blacks from voting in the South, but also in other parts of the country, it required those states through what was called a pre-clearance process to get clearance from the Justice Department if they changed any voter law that could have a disproportionate impact on Black voters and voters of color. That section of the voting rights law was essential because it really helped to push back against efforts to further undermine the right to vote through more sophisticated means. When that section was essentially gutted, it opened up the floodgates for states around the country, not just in the South, but in the Midwest and in other parts of the country, to start imposing and erecting new barriers that made it more difficult for certain communities to vote. Now, many of these are much more covert, much more sophisticated. They're not as blatant as a poll tax or as some of the tactics that were used in the civil rights struggle, but they have the direct intent to try to derail and delay much of the demographic change that is happening in this country. Now, one of my real hopes, and certainly I haven't seen this come to pass yet, but I still hope it could happen, is that the Republican Party as a whole could make a decision that instead of trying to make it more difficult to vote, they could weigh on the side of supporting it, making it easier to vote. And they could also decide to try to become a more big tent party, to change some of their policies and rhetoric and some of their outreach to try to actually campaign and appeal to Black voters, Latino voters, and to Asian voters, and to others. And while there may be some that support that approach, it feels like, particularly after what we saw in 2020, the GOP is doubling down on a very dangerous course of further trying to restrict the right to vote around the country. And what makes that even worse, a strategy to make it easier for state legislators to literally overturn election results. So bills that were passed in Georgia and Texas recently and other states are literally making it easier for state legislators to ignore the legitimate election results and potentially to overturn them in future elections. That poses a real existential threat to our democracy because it could both create a huge degree of conflict and it really is helping to delegitimize and undermine our electoral process. Now, I want to really emphasize 3 points. I'm a Baptist and I am a preacher, and I'm not here to preach today, but I want to just make sure that I reinforce and that you hear 3 critical points. So if you don't kind of hear or take away anything from our time together, I'm really hoping and praying you really hear and take away these 3 points. The first is that voter suppression is real, but voter fraud is a fabricated myth and a lie. I'll talk in a moment about what I mean by voter suppression, but there is no evidence, no substantial evidence at least, that we have a serious challenge in our electoral system with voter fraud. And yet, despite the inability of the Republican Party and more recently of Trump to be able to provide evidence of voter fraud, he claimed that it was widespread voter fraud that led to a stolen election. Much of the Republican Party and Republicans continue to double down on that lie and to continue to believe it, which again erodes trust within our electoral system. The second is that these assaults on the right to vote represent a core issue of Imago Dei, a core assault on Imago Dei. Our voting is really at the heart, it's the lifeblood of our democracy. And Imago Dei is the lifeblood of our faith. We believe that every single person, every single voter is made in the image and likeness of God. And that if there is an effort out there, which I'm arguing there is, to try to limit or to make it more difficult for certain people to vote, that is not just an assault on our democracy, that is also an assault on Imago Dei, on human dignity. And I think we really have to frame this in that way, that this should not be a partisan issue. And yet we know that there's direct efforts to try to make it more difficult for communities of color to vote. The third point is that we can't just protect the right to vote in this moment. We have to have a broader commitment to safeguard and revitalize, maybe even transform our democracy. It gets into some of the points that Jeff raised at the beginning. We need to change the ways in which states are able to gerrymander districts. We have now reached the point, at least in the last election, that 80% of all congressional election races were decided in the primary. What that means is that usually the more extreme, more ideological candidates can only make it through the primary, if that is where the real race is happening. And part of the reason why such a high proportion of races are decided in the primary is because so many congressional districts have been gerrymandered in a way to essentially enable politicians to choose their voters rather than the other way around. We also know that there's many other reforms that are necessary, everything from making Election Day a national holiday, having national standards so that we can have a real sense of consistency across our election system, making DC a state, which I know is not popular among some, but no taxation without representation, I think is a very strong argument. We can talk more about that if you're interested. In addition to a number of other ethics reforms and kind of getting money out of politics, all of these things are going to be crucial for helping to revitalize and to reinvent our democratic system. I'll end with this. Many of you will recognize the timeless words of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, who said, "There is no progress without struggle." And I believe that is true when it comes to protecting our democracy. Our democracy is fragile. It is not a given. It requires the engagement of us as citizens. And I would argue it requires the engagement of us as Christians and as pastors and as disciples of Christ. John Lewis, I'm still deeply humbled by this, wrote the foreword to my book, More Perfect Union, before he went on to glory. And he argued that the right to vote is sacred. It literally is the most powerful nonviolent weapon we have in our possession. And so the last thing I'll make kind of clearer is what are some of these tactics? This, just, to make it plain, there are 400 bills that have been proposed in 49 states that would make it more difficult for communities of color in particular, and in some cases the elderly, and in some cases students, to vote. They include making it more easy to purge voters who have moved or haven't responded to a piece of mail. And that tends to disproportionately hurt communities of color. It includes ending early voting or restricting early voting. Again, something that people of color tend to take advantage of more. It includes reducing the number of polling sites or moving them to the last minute. It includes disinformation campaigns, which often has included robocalls. It includes intimidation at voting places and even the threat of violence at voting places. It includes efforts to try to restrict vote by mail, which we know was wildly successful as it expanded as a result of the COVID pandemic. And so that just gives you a sense of some of the concrete things, the tactics that are being used to make it more difficult to vote. And I believe that as Christian leaders, we have both, again, the responsibility and the opportunity in this moment to help to ensure that the right to vote is protected, and that ultimately we can safeguard our democracy itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adam, for inviting us into this deeper engagement and informing us about it. Can I ask you, or even a Sojourners colleague who I know are also on the call, can you state in the chat box just some of the tactics that you mentioned? I heard you mention 400 bills in 49 states as an example of the voter suppression that's happening. And then I heard you go on to list some of the tactics. If you could state those in the chat, that will be helpful. And so it's time for our discussion now to ask questions. One question was posed by Rodney Litch of how are we defining democracy? And I'd like us to get to that in a moment. And transparently, while we were meeting and even a couple of days prior, I've asked a couple of colleagues who I knew were going to participate today to briefly begin the conversation for us, open the way so that others could have opportunity to think about their comments or questions. But a question that I would like for this table to discuss is, where are you seeing democracy in trouble in your communities, and how is it being addressed? Among this table are Christians who are serving in public positions, in political positions. And among them is Dr. Rosalind Osgood, who is the executive director of Mount Olive Development Corporation in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. That's how she's in partnership with ABHMS through her work. And she's also the president of the Broward County School Board. So Rosalind, thanks for joining us. And can I ask you to open our conversation with your response or comments to anything that Adam shared?
Certainly, Reverend. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And as I was listening, I am excited, but I'm also saddened. When I think about the years of work and advocacy, the people that have died for us to have the right to vote, for us to operate in a democracy, and I see it under outright attack, aggressive attack. So I'm in Fort Lauderdale, Broward County to be specific. Many of you have probably seen me all over the news over the last month, simply fighting to protect people in school with masks. Our governor has decided that we shouldn't mandate masks, even though we were at a COVID positivity rate of 17% in Florida, leading the chart most days with people dying. So I see democracy being attacked where it's totally circumventing local authority. The local citizenry elects local school board members to make policies for local school boards. That further extends voter suppression. When people in their community vote for local representation and the governor overrides it or usurps it, it suppresses the vote of those persons that voted for those individuals. Not only are we told we can't do it, we're now being sanctioned, where the governor is now withholding our salary because we didn't vote his way. He says that we're violating the parents' bill of choice. So when I'm in a district with 260,000 parents, whose rights do I uphold? We've averaged about 8 students that don't want to wear masks out of 260,000. We have a large number of students with disabilities that have pre-existing conditions that you have to protect. So we see an all outright attack on democracy from a voter suppression perspective, from a local authority perspective, from a perspective that particularly targets Black and brown people and immigrants who are not Black and brown people. All of this stuff that we see at the borders, all of the laws and the harsh language that's used. We see the attack against our LGBTQ students where, you know, if kids identify as transgender, they're legislating. We see them now attacking Roe versus Wade. Whatever your stance is on abortions, it's kind of not the government's right to be trying to tell a woman in any circumstance what to do with her body. And I think that if we look at history, we see the racism that was spoken about early. You're in public policy. It is systemic racism. And until we get to a point where we trust God enough to talk about anti-racism, nothing changed. We use nice words like equity, and we want equity because it gives us equal access. But until we become an anti-racist nation, we won't have equal outcomes. Access is equal opportunities, but anti-racism means equal outcomes. And when we look at the outcomes, they are very different for certain groups of people. No one is talking right now about mass incarceration. That's the new form of slavery. We tear down the public school systems and it sends a pipeline to jail. We constantly see money taken away from the public school system. The public school system and education is the equalizer for most people. A lot of poor people do not have an option for a private school or a charter school. They're not going to take them, and nor do they have the economic means to pay the tuition. So if you give them a poor quality of public education, you put them in a predicament of survival mode. And in order to survive, they commit crimes, they get strung out on drugs. I could go on and on. But we have to pay attention to what's in the details of the policy, because the policy will have a nice heading. And then when you look at all the things that are added in the policy where they attach all these things together, and then it passes and it becomes law. And finally, we have to hold people that we vote for, people that we love, that we live with, accountable. We can't give anybody a pass. If I'm elected to the state Senate, I can't get in the state and start voting a different way on things that's now going to have a negative impact on my people because nobody's paying attention to it. But I think as people of faith, we are really embarrassing God because we're not acting like people of faith. We're not praying, we're not crying out. Jesus was one of the most radical politicians that ever walked on the face of this earth. When are we as a people going to move outside the walls of the four walls of the church, and really stand up for justice, liberty, and equality, the freedom that comes with salvation? This is why Jesus died, to give us that salvation so that we could be a witness. So when I wake up every morning, I ask myself, what kind of witness am I for God today when it comes to ensuring that the next generation have life better than I have it? What kind of behavior am I modeling? Am I practicing good stewardship by being silent? Am I practicing good stewardship by not calling people out who are registered to vote but don't vote? So I think that we need to come up with a strategy with a few goals, and we need to get serious, and we need to pray, and we need to do the gospel. Just saying how good God is and how much we trust him, we need to live it. It is rough in Florida right now. Every day is something, a new law or something to set us back. Democracy is certainly under attack. And if we're not careful, we'll be in a dictatorship, and Black and brown people will be in a new form of slavery. It's like Jim Crow 2.0, but right now Jim Crow is wearing a suit and calling himself attorney this, attorney that, and they're putting these policies in place so the rich gets richer and the poor gets poorer, and the poor suffer the consequence, whether it's mental illness, whether it's health issues, and I could just go on and on. So this is such a needed form, and we have to continue this dialogue, but we have to come up with an action plan. And what is the action? It's to organize.
Reverend, and Reverend Oscar, there'll be opportunity for everything you've shared. Thank you. And please allow me to invite some others to share, but we will have opportunity to come back. But thank you. I want to ask now if Dr. Corey Fields, pastor of Calvary Baptist Church of Newark, Delaware, will share. And among this call, we have pastors, we have chaplains, leaders of community ministries from coast to coast. So just a great representation of American Baptist leadership present today. Yes, Corey, can you share, please?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity. Adam Russell Taylor, thank you for your words, for your book, and for leading us today, and for the comments that preceded me. Thank you for those also. I'll try not to be too scattered in what I've jotted down to say, but as we think about the threats to democracy, and particularly what that has, how that intersects with the church, and what is the job of the church in this space, I think about how, as a pastor, I think about how these things and why these things have taken hold among the people. And you're talking people who are in the pews and people who are in our American Baptist churches, some of whom these things have taken hold. And so, for example, there was talk about the white people becoming a minority in the not too distant future in the United States. And we know that is indeed manifested for some white Americans as a threat, but the tricky part about this is that its output appears unrelated. Sometimes what we hear in family systems theory is the presenting issue is often not the real issue, right? And people have been trained, discipled, if you will. I'm going to come back to that, to use the issue of voter fraud and other things of that nature to be the presenting issue that is more acceptable, rather than the very deep-seated threat that many people feel from these demographic shifts. It's buried between many layers of narrative that people might not even recognize themselves. And when we are leaders, pastors, thought leaders, or prophets of any kind, I have found it so difficult to get past those many, many thick layers of narrative under which this more raw nervousness about cultural shift is buried. The efforts to give a different narrative and the efforts to layer these narratives is very well funded through a lot of sources that people consume all the time. And I actually think that during the pandemic, it got worse. I don't have data on that, but people had a lot of extra time in front of their computers, and they consume a lot of toxic stuff on social media, from podcasts. Podcasts right now are a big thing that people are listening to when it comes to many different issues. So one of the questions that kind of flummox me is, how do we as pastors and prophets and leaders speak past the many layers of narrative that have been intentionally put on top of the more raw emotions that people have and the things that have been created? So you have all these things that people talk about that have actually been manufactured. I actually have to admit that I was not aware, of how effectively anger could be manufactured, and how effectively people can be made afraid of something that doesn't exist, or a threat that isn't real. And I think the other thing I want to make sure I say, and when we talk about the threats to democracy, one for me would be this manufactured fear and the layers of narrative under which this stuff is buried. But lastly, just hyper individualism that has really formed and shaped Christians for a long time now. But not just hyper individualism, that used to be the thing. Now today I see it morphing into almost anarchism. It seems like over the last few years, people have gone from being hyper individualistic to almost anarchists, where, sovereign citizens used to be a fringe idea. But did you see the New York Times article about how well this movement is organized now, and how there was a gentleman who took over a lady's house saying that he's a sovereign citizen? We have ideas around individualism, personal freedoms, And just the idea that I shouldn't have to be told what to do or shouldn't have rules to follow, that is just downright confusing, and how much it's taken hold and how complex this web of information has become. So once again, as a pastor, one of my concerns is what or who is discipling people. As a pastor, I want people to be discipled primarily by Jesus. But more and more, there's a challenge that was articulated very well by Jonathan Martin on Twitter a few years ago. He said a 30-minute sermon won't teach people to love neighbors their cable news teaches them all week to fear or hate. They've already been discipled. We have a very effective discipleship program in this country, and the church is not running it. So how do we counter it?
Corey, I'm going to thank you for that. I want us to pause right here because Corey, you raised two very important questions. One, how do we speak past the many layers of manufactured narratives? And two, how does the church counteract the discipleship engines that are prevalent in our culture? Let me pause there. So I would like people to, to pick up on those two questions, and Adam, give you opportunity also, because you speak, I know, in your book about this exchange between individualism versus the interdependence. Last comment before we answer those questions. The one thing, Dr. Osgood, that you have spoken about, that I've heard you speak about, and as time allows before we end the call, I want to come back to this. Dr. Osgood, you've spoken about the importance of people of faith and following the Jesus that we're sort of collectively speaking about. People who follow that Jesus to be more active in seeking political positions. But let's go back to this narrative piece and discipleship piece. Who wants to comment to what Dr. Corey has offered? If anyone's speaking, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying if someone was speaking, I couldn't hear you. Adam, yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, I want to hear from other voices, but I really appreciated both comments from Reverend Osgood and Dr. Fields. In terms of the importance and need to counteract narratives, I couldn't agree more. I come out of a kind of organizing and advocacy background, and one of my mentors is a professor who teaches organizing up at Harvard named Marshall Gantz, and he has written extensively and teaches extensively about the power of public narrative, that we are shaped by the stories we tell ourselves. And as you said, there are layers within that. We are so often unconscious, and I write about this in my book in a chapter that's all about unmasking the myths that have really shaped our DNA, that so many of these kind of myths that are part of the American ethos and psyche, that we're a chosen nation, that we're an innocent nation, that we're a Christian nation even. Obviously, as Baptists, we know that we actually were a nation that was founded on the separation of church and state, recognizing the dangers of fusing the state with religion. And so, there's no single or quick antidote to the challenge of distorted narratives. But what I try to argue in my book, and what I've tried to also kind of do through Sojourners, and Sojourners has been doing this for almost 50 years, is to try to cast a biblical vision that provides a countervailing narrative to that which is what you just named, a narrative of hyper-individualism, which I think has become essentially an idol and is one of the biggest challenges we face in the context of the COVID pandemic, or a narrative of white Christian nationalism, which really has been a poisonous part of the bloodstream of America and of the church. And I would argue really reared its head on January 6th during the insurrection and has not gone away, but continues to be a real significant threat. And so I offer up the beloved community moral vision as at least one vision that I think could unite the majority of Americans, because it ties into our shared religious and civic values. And I really try to unpack what the beloved community means for us today. But I think that's so important. The other thing that I just want to emphasize quickly, and this is a little bit of a different point, but it's related. And I'll just be really candid, I was extremely deflated and disappointed that so many good-hearted pastors were silent in the midst of the 2020 election, particularly in the aftermath of that election. Not all, and certainly many on this call, I'm sure were quite outspoken in naming the big lie and trying to communicate why that lie was such a threat to our democracy. But unfortunately, many, including within the Baptist tradition, have kind of taken this risk-averse approach of political neutrality, that we don't want to further divide our church. And so we're not going to speak out, even if we know what is happening is wrong. And the challenge then, of course, is that you're giving license, you're kind of agreeing to the status quo by not resisting those lies and not speaking out against them. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, to be silent is actually to speak, it's an action. And so I would just encourage us that this is a moment where I think the church needs to have more courage. And we can't do that in a way that is nakedly partisan, but we have to do it in a way that really tries, as I said before, to be the conscience of the state. And while it's hard to break through all of what people are hearing from social media or from Fox or from other sources, if we can't engage our church members in a civil dialogue about what's happening and what's at stake, and really try to dispel fact from fiction, then I am quite concerned about what we actually mean by discipling people. And discipleship requires some sacrifice and some risk.
Thank you. Were there any other comments from the community regarding narrative or discipleship? There's two others who in our at the table who I'm going to ask for their commentary, but just wanted to give space for that around what we've heard thus far.
Lisa?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to respond. First, I'd like to say that greetings from the great state of Oregon, where we've been voting by mail for 25 years. And there's no voting precincts. Our kitchen table becomes our voting booth. We get our ballots a month beforehand and can process the material well. I'm struck by the conversation, and I was reminded in this discussion of what happened to the American Baptists in Los Angeles in 1941, 1942, when the Americans were being placed in internment camps. And the American Baptists in that city advocated for and stood next to the Japanese Americans when everybody else wanted to put them away into concentration camps. They never forgot it. They have never forgotten the faithfulness of the witness of those who followed Jesus at that time and befriended them and walked with them during that time. And so I think part of discipleship is actually living it out in a way where you stand with people in this kind of fashion. And no matter what the narrative is that has followed since then, the Japanese American Baptists that have been a part of Los Angeles have been faithful to the commitment and the relationship that they had built upon a generation before and even now. So I'm not sure how that addresses this, but I think one act of faithful witness in relationship can countermand all sorts of negative narratives that are going on in the world. Isn't that what our faith is in this way? So that's all I would want to bring to the table today. I share with you the concerns of the world, but I hold to one who has changed my life as well as changed our lives and stands with us even in the midst of the kind of dark storms that were in that Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself had to face himself. So I'm waiting to hear the good news here. So courage, my friends.
Beautiful. Yes, the hope is interwoven, and even as Ada was saying, that there are pieces of which he's hopeful about, and we'll give opportunity for more expression of that before we conclude the call. Rodney Lynch, you asked us, Reverend Lynch, your chaplain at the Baptist Foundation at Purdue University in Indiana. And you asked the question in the chat of, what do we mean, how we define democracy? And so we can consider that question in addition to any reflection you may have for us today.
Thank you, Isa. And thanks all of you for your presence and contributions. So for me, I'm wrestling with what is democracy, because when you only have two choices, I don't think that's a democracy. When you can win the popular vote and lose because of the electoral college, then I don't know, I'm not so sure we are in a democracy, right? And so until every vote matters, and until when every human of age has access to vote, or equal access to vote, I'm not so sure we are in a democracy. Democracy has been in trouble for quite some time. And again, when corporate America, when corporate money determines the outcomes, that's not a democracy. And so here in this community where I serve, I'm coming from a different lens when it comes to democracy, because I was just talking to a couple of students yesterday. They're juniors, and they asked me what happened to the Emerging Leaders Program. And the Emerging Leaders Program is a program that was geared towards giving underrepresented students and marginalized students the opportunity to emerge on this campus. And so within the last 3 years, where this program was about 70, 80 African-American, and then 10, 20 others, or people of color, better yet, it's now 70, 80% of white students. And the rest are people of color, and maybe about 5% of African-American students. And that even trickles down to the polytech schools in Indianapolis that's supposed to help bring more African-American students into the STEM program here at Purdue. And those numbers have shifted, right? And the problem with this is that the students have no voice in it. The administration are making these decisions. So what kind of democracy are we in when college-age students who are suffering, especially the marginalized ones and underrepresented ones, have no voice in this type of shift? And then finally, to Dr. Osgood's point, and when we talk about what disciple are we following, or how somebody asked the question in the chat about following disciple, or what Jesus we're following, we're in a polarized faith, I guess. Ruby Sells puts it like this. She calls it Christofascism, where we have Christians who puts Christ or the cross on the side of empire. We put Christ on the side of enslavers. We put Christ on the side of segregationists, Jerry Falwell. We put Christ on the side of Donald Trump, Franklin Graham. And so when you have folks that put Christ or the cross on the side of empire, then you have us, or some of us, who put Christ on the side of on the side of the oppressed. That is a lot of tension there. Better yet, that's a polarization of our faith. And look, it's either one or the other. God can't be on both sides, not in my opinion. I'm on James Cone's side. God is on the side of the oppressed, from Genesis to Revelation, the way I read the scriptures. And so That, I think, is a big tension or struggle within our faith. Thank you.
That's all right. Appreciate it. And for every question that you've raised. And let's struggle with it, colleagues. And while we're struggling, not to be left, Reverend Chakravarti Zada, you are pastor in Waukesha, Wisconsin, First Baptist Church, Waukesha. What do you have to say to us? What have you heard today?
Thank you so much for this opportunity, kind of be part of this wonderful conversation. Thanks you, Adam, for your presentation. My perspective comes from understanding democracy. And, America is considered to be the oldest democracy, if I'm right. Don't quote me on that. I just hear that all the time. While India tells that it is the largest democracy. And so I, coming from India, kind of wanted to see and understand my own faith and to see what Christianity is, what Christ's teachings are. And therefore, that helps me to provide an objective lens to the issues that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day daily basis. And some of the things that some of those presenters have already called on is the political polarization and the nationalism. These two are very important because part of my dissertation work is all about mission as reconciling presence, a response to Hindutva. So that's the lens I come from. So for me, Hindutva is a right-wing Hindu ideology. And I claim Christ to be somebody who is the, in James Cone's words, a God of oppressor. So all these untouchable Dalits choose to become Christian, therefore their hope lies in being oppressed by the state. And you see how these demographies that you talked about, mentioning about 2024, the white majority will become the minority of the state. And that's the tension. Even in India, the high caste Brahmins have kind of somehow in the new statistics understood that they are no longer the elite of the society who can continue to run the country based on the caste system. But now we have economic empowerment, education to the missionary communities and mission movements, and now the Dalits, who are the untouchables, have come into play. And then order, right, becomes critical piece in democracy, because by your oath, you become participant in the public domain of being who our leaders and how this nation look like. Now, when this issue had come in, comfortably, the minority, I would call minority upper caste people want to construct a false narrative of nationalism. And then this new nationalism, here you want to build a Ram Raj, the ideal kingdom where justice is established. And then you are the ones who are the high caste ones are called to be building this. And so a new narrative of hyper-nationalism constructed in India. So that's where all about my doctoral dissertation comes in. And I always did a presentation to help the so-called Christians to see objectively, because when I talk about Hinduism, it's easy for you to see where they're wrong. But then use that lens to show how we Christians, when we talk about hyper-nationalism, our right-wing Christian ideology to defend some things that are not affirming human identity, then that's when we don't become transformational. So when I'm here as a pastor, I'm trying to help see people objectively when the same thing is done by Hinduism, how sinful it is, to kind of see how sinfully we practice that as Christians in this country, and depriving somebody something that you consider them on whatever economic basis, skin color, you name all those race categories. And then when you dehumanize them and bring Jesus into the narrative and talk about hyper-nationalism or nationalism that's centered around pride of American dream or whatever that you construct, that is not at all transformational. And that is the challenge of democracy. And therefore, what I would argue is, how do we become a community? And so I call this in my dissertation as reconciling presence. So this is inspired by Desmond Tutu's work, and he called it as Tubu theology, where he said, I am because you are. So I am not myself without taking the other into consideration. So when you talk about reconciliation, when you don't have the enemy, the perpetrator, and they're dead and gone, to whom you get reconciled? And that's a question I took back to my own community when the high caste feel that their religious duty to oppress the other, and it is justified by the religion, then what does reconciliation look like? Therefore, I would say, being the disciples of Jesus Christ, we call ourselves to be reconciling presence. So when you don't have the oppressor, you continue to struggle, deconstructing the narrative, what Jacqueline Derrida talks about, to deconstruct the narrative and to kind of see the dominating factors in the text, and to kind of go to the what James Cone says, the God of oppressor, to discover the new God of oppressor. So that has been my call to be a pastor in First Baptist here in Waukesha. When I walk into the downtown clergy meetings from all the denominations, I'm the only person of color walking into this space. Even though I come in as a person of color, even though the conversations are more about LGBT and all other things, homelessness and all those things that are part of the conversations, but I still see that we have always been providing lip service, because we as church have taken this and used that as our words and vocabulary to kind of be that our narrative, but then have failed to be the transformation that we want to see as ourselves. And so this is a good point that that is lifted up by Dalit theologian James Massey. So what now, Dalit theology has been hijacked by the high caste Christians. So now no longer Dalit theology, which is the expression of Dalits, is not voicing the Dalits himself. Now you become a white man presenting a black theology. So you don't even have the freedom to present your own black theology. Now, because the black theology has got the market now. So that's exactly what is happening here, that our voices has been hijacked. Our voices have been taught by somebody else. And how does that becomes our reconciling presence? Yes, the democracy is a threat, and political polarization is what is happening. And therefore this is my life journey. So that's where my dissertation learning and being a small church pastor in Wisconsin, I'm daily trying to see how I can motivate my own congregation to be actively involved in the voters' rights. And that's why I'm actively involved with Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign, and to kind of see how important is it. I mean, I know the value of vote coming from India. And so I encourage people to take time to vote. Silence speaks. Somebody already mentioned about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I think church as American Baptists, we are called to be into this mission of reconciling presence. So it's not about just making voice, but also living it, and to kind of deconstruct the colonizing systems and structures that we ourselves practice as a church. We're not just voices, but also presence, to continue to show that as an engagement. And I don't want to preach now. I just want to pause there to kind of think on those levels. That's where I am passionate about. And I'm so thankful, Adam, for your presentation, and especially Rodney for chaplain. That's a wonderful perspective, and others too, Corey and others. Thanks for that.
Good. So let's talk. I want to invite others into the conversation. It's not a fully developed thought. It can be a thought that's information. It can be a phrase. What are you thinking about based on what you're hearing? You can offer comment in chat. Dr. Turner Triplett, glad you're here at the table, and you raise a book of Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, and how that's playing out in this country. So just thoughts. What are people thinking as you're listening?
Reverend Lisa?
Yes.
Hi, this is Cheryl Bird. I bring greetings from Neighborhoods Focused on African American Youth. And what I have to share may seem somewhat elementary to most of you, but to be honest, my back, and what I focus on is I'm focused on improving the outcome of youth living in high poverty neighborhoods. So I've been focused on helping children and families move from poverty to a better way of life. And that came about through a call from God. So, and I'm mentioning this because somewhere in all that we're discussing, to me, the real root of the problem is, what are we doing in our churches? Now, we're going to churches and we're building churches, and that's a blessing, and we're helping, but are we people maturing, trying to mature to the point where they're looking to see what it is that God wants them to do and to go out and do it? Because the reality is, and I can take this back to, I don't want to lose our rights related to voting, like none of you want to lose them either. But as long as we have people who lack wisdom, lack compassion, have no heart, filled with greed, power hungry, in places where they make decisions, we're going to have this situation. So I'm a grassroots kind of person. I am a grassroots person. Let's get down into the nitty gritty, trying to affect change in people. And so my question is really where we are to me, and I love the Lord. I love him. But the reality is, where we are to me, I feel like it's Christians. I feel like we've dropped the ball. I don't know that maybe God is calling us to be what the church needs to be in all areas, and how we are, and helping people to mature in their faith to a point where they are ready for God, because God can equip any one of us or all of us to go out here and take care. He can take care of the problem right now with one of us or without any of us. But he equipped us to be able to handle this situation. And so I somehow or another, in whatever we decide, we still have got to look at the church and what is not going on in the church that has allowed us to get to this point in our society.
Thank you so much, and that's a beautiful segue, your question or your comment. And Adam, I'm going to invite you initially to start this. Can you speak to where, Adam, where the church and church leaders have picked up the ball?
Absolutely. I'm going to get right into that. I just want to say one quick comment to Reverend Rodney's really important points, and also kind of building on Dr. Zeta, which is that democracy is messy and is flawed, has been flawed from the beginning, will continue to be flawed in the future. There is no achieving a more perfect union without helping to achieve a more perfect democracy, even if a perfect democracy will never quite exist, right? And so that being said, I mean, the 2016 election was decided by 60,000 votes in 4 Midwestern states. The 2020 election was decided by 40,000 votes in Arizona and in Georgia. So we're talking about very slim margins that literally determine whether we have a second term of Trump. And I think that would have been a very existential threat to our democracy long term, or to our country in a sense, or a first term of Biden. So I'm saying that in part to kind of say part of what is so needed in this moment, and I would really describe this as a Selma moment. Thinking back to that moment before the Voting Rights Act was passed, King, months after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, went to Lyndon Johnson, president at the time, and said, we need a Voting Rights Act. That is the next step. Johnson threw up his hands and said, I have cast all my political capital. I can't help you. So King went out and organized with SCLC and SNCC and others, went to Selma. We know the history, the Bloody Sunday, etc. Well, I don't wish for another Bloody Sunday, I do think this is a moment where we really have to dig deep and organize. And that's what has been happening with many churches. So Sojourners has partnered with Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, who leads the Skinner Leadership Institute and the National African American Clergy Network, and created an initiative back in 2016 called Lawyers and Callers Turnout Sunday, because we recognized that the Black church in particular had to lead in this moment, and we need white allies and Asian allies and Latino allies to join with us in order to protect the right to vote, but ultimately in a bigger sense to kind of save our democracy. And so in 2016, we focused on 9 battleground states where we helped to equip and train clergy and churches to engage in voter registration. We know in almost every state, except in places like, well, almost every state, you have to be registered in order to be able to vote. To engage in voter protection efforts, which consisted of what was called a We Are Watching component, where we literally advocated with secretaries of state and senior election officials to try to ensure that they were on notice, that we were going to hold them accountable to a free, fair, and safe election. And then on election day, and then we did a lot of voter education, a lot of turnout, which was critical as well. Then on election day, we partnered with the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights and literally had pastors, clergy, often in their, we don't all wear collars, but in suits or what have you, show up on election day alongside lawyers to provide a moral presence. We call them chaplains on election day. In this last election in 2020, we trained 2,500 clergy in nine states, including states like Georgia and Wisconsin and Ohio and Florida and many others, to show up at vulnerable polling sites to try to prevent any risk of violence and to be able to encourage people to vote and to be able to provide troubleshooting if any problems arose at polling sites. Now, we're very confident that we help to provide a kind of deterrent to intimidation and violence at polling sites. And we were able to ensure that there was kind of this moral presence. So it's a very, very practical way that clergy can exercise their faithful response in this moment. And the last thing I want to mention is that part of the reason why I think this is a Selma moment, we desperately need federal legislation to both restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act, and there's literally a bill that's been proposed that passed the House of Representatives that's been stuck in the Senate because of Republican opposition, named after John Lewis, called the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act, which would literally help to restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act, and particularly Section 4. And then there's a bill that is also stuck called the Freedom to Vote Act that builds on a bill that used to be called the For the People Act that would be much more comprehensive. It would deal with ethics reform, campaign finance reform. It would help to eliminate gerrymandering across the country. And it would help to prevent voter suppression efforts, including the most dangerous manifestation of those efforts, which are these bills that are making it easier to overturn election results. And so we are working in a much larger coalition. Would love the kind of more strong support of the American Baptist Church to try to ensure in the next 2 months that we can get both these bills across the finish line. The last thing I'll say, just to inject a little bit of political reality, because of pretty much across the board Republican opposition to these bills, it's going to take a carve out of the filibuster in order to get these bills accomplished across the finish line. I know that that has lots of other risk attached to it, but we have to remind ourselves that the filibuster was used the most to block civil rights legislation in the 1950s and 60s. It is a rule, a Senate rule that could be relaxed, it could be changed, and it's desperately needed that there is a carve out, a suspension of it, so that we can protect the right to vote and to protect our democracy. Because if you start playing with the rules of the game, which is exactly what's happening right now, we are literally going to see an undermining of the legitimacy of whatever results happen. And we're going to see this continued strategy of trying to suppress the right to vote in a way that attacks Imago Dei. So those are some really concrete things that can happen from the local level to the national level. You can learn more about this effort at turnoutsunday.org. And we would love to work with your churches. Even if you're not in one of these 9 key states, we need this work to be happening all across the country.
Thank you, Adam. We are literally gathering for 15 more minutes. We're staying at the table. And so are there just other questions? What has this conversation raised for importance for you sitting at this table? Why did you come to the conversation today?
So Reverend Lee, if I could, I was very inspired by what I just heard, and it's what I had mentioned to you about people of faith running for public office.
Great.
That's where you really make the change at. By my secular training, it's in public administration, and then I have my Master's of Divinity, and it allows me to bring it all together. Unless you have moral people at the table making these decisions that understands reconciliation, building consensus, we don't get the change. I think that we're naive. We don't really give voice to the temptation of parochial self-interest. It is an alluring temptation. And many people, once they get in public office, they get allured by it. They get inveigled by it. But morality and faith keeps us at a place where we are focused on community and people and being Christ-like. I'm a part of a group here called Faith in Florida, and we organize all across the state with clergy. We do a lot of the same work with phone banking, voter turnout. We lead, I think last election we led 47 souls to the polls. We almost had a souls to the poll in every county in the state of Florida. Right now, we're working aggressively to expand the democracy, specifically targeting suburban areas, rural areas, those small areas that a lot of people overlook because they're not large in numbers. But when you look at how close elections are, you know that every number counts. So I think we have to organize. I agree with that wholeheartedly. But we have to get serious about educating and training and equipping people of faith to run for office. A lot of times people are interested, but they don't know the wherewithal. And I believe it's like the Reverend said earlier, I forget her name, it's the grassroots people. When I think about how I lived homeless 32 years ago on the streets battling with addiction, I never would have thought that I would be in public office. But all of those experiences and how God has navigated my life gives me a strong testimony at the table, a strong conviction at the table, and a perspective a lot of times that's lost at the table because the common person, their voice is not at the table. So I do think that our democracy is on the line, the bills that were mentioned. How do we educate our clergy that they're able to discuss these bills and understand the importance of why we need the John Lewis Voter Protection Act that won't allow states like Florida to make all these policies without getting a clearance to sabotage the vote. So a lot of it is the education, empowering the clergy to get the information. And I just believe it's something about making ourselves available that the Holy Spirit does the work that it needs to convict us and give us the passion and the burden that we need to make a difference. So me, I feel like, you know, it's a Jeremiah experience. When he heard about what was happening in his hometown, he had to act. And I think that's where we are. If we're not taking action around democracy today, I don't think we're shedding light on our witness. And when we talk about liberation theology, we're the instruments of liberation. And it has to be radical, and it has to be transformative, and it has to be revolutionary. We have to take the gospel, as my father in the ministry, Dr. Matt King Carter would say, we have to take the gospel from the pulpit to the pavement.
And if I may,
Yes.
I'd just like to add to what Dr. Osgood just said. This is Jeff Hagray, and with respect to taking the gospel from the pulpit to the pavement, I agree so strongly. And I think that includes I think that so many within the Christian church, as we know, we're socialized to believe that as Christians, we would just kind of in maybe a kind of Pauline train of thought, let today, whatever be as it is, Christ is going to come again soon and so forth. And politics is for somebody else, but not for us as people of faith. Fundamentally, I think we need to get to the point where we just admit that that was bad teaching, that was bad, bad theology, distorted theology. And in my own reading of the scriptures, when I hear Jesus say to those who ask him about the state, he talks about render to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. I take that to also mean fulfill our civic obligation as citizens and fulfill our faith obligation as persons who belong to that beloved community that Adam was talking about. And I think we have to look critically at even the first century church in Acts, one of the first models of beloved community, where it says, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' teaching and doctrine, but they went from house to house. They were breaking bread. They were doing good among the people. They were selling their possessions, giving their possessions to other people in the spirit of what Cheryl Bursch was talking about. They were very actively engaged in the betterment and in the improvement of their community. And there's one clause that says, and they also glorified God, which means that worship was also part of what that first community did. In addition to their mission engagement in their wider community. And so I think we need a more comprehensive appreciation of separation of church and state, and understand that separation of church and state in America means that the church is not a state-run or state-owned church, okay? It means that we are not subjects of the state. It means that we are free. We have freedom of speech, we have freedom of press, and we have all these freedoms. There is a separation of church and state, so that the clergy, the faithful, are not employees of the state. You can speak truth to power. Clergy can speak about injustices and wrongdoing and about public policy and so forth and so on, because there is a separation of church and state. The clergy are not subject to the whims of the queen or the king, that they can disagree with the president and so forth. And then lastly, I would say, in terms of a moral vision for our community, whose responsibility is that? And I think that we leave it too often to elected officials to set the framework for a moral vision for a beloved community, for justice, for righteousness and ethics. But throughout history, it has been shown that in actual point of fact, people of faith, whether it's the Dietrich Bonhoeffers or the Martin Luther King Jr.'s and many other names that we know, have often been at the forefront of defining what just community looks like. And so we cannot leave it to elected officials to define just community for a senator or the Congress or the state house or the mayor, that we have a role. And until we begin to see that we are derelict in our responsibility as people of faith, if we don't speak to social issues, to access to healthcare, access to quality education, and all the things that make for that full quality of life, that abundant life that even Jesus taught about, that until we are engaged in speaking that and articulating that without concern or fear of the risk of speaking truth, I think that the church is is going to continue to be more and more taken for granted, not taken seriously, and that contributes to the dones and the nuns, the people who are done with church and the people who have no need for church in their life, because until the church really speaks to the issues where they live on a daily basis and shows how to practice my faith to change the world and to make the world a better place, I think we will see a declining relevance of the church in the eyes of so many people. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Other comments before we have a closing comment? I see Bill Gaventa, American Baptist, who strong for years, an advocate in so many different ways among us. Is there anything you want to say for the table to hear? We see your comments in the chat. And thank you, Adam, for all that you included in the chat. Please pay attention to different links that are provided there for your reference.
I don't need to say anything. I've just appreciated everybody's voices and listening and trying to kind of gather, sort out what it means for me kind of at the gut. And the last sort of comments speak to that, I think, is how do we, in the plethora of voices talking about the doom facing our democracy, which I agree with, how do we give people concrete ways to act and and do what they can with what they often consider to be until they work on it, their limited tool set.
Very good. And we'll be intentional as we share even about this conversation today, to share with the broader community. And this recording will become available for everyone who's here today and others. But yes, that's you are absolutely right that is our among our tasks. Okay. Okay, then it does feel as though we are appropriately coming to a close today. I did want to give you, Jeff, an opportunity, though you've offered comments specifically, to just offer a closing comment. And I want to invite someone at the table. I'm looking among the participants, and I'll actually, if someone by a raise of hand would like to close us in prayer, please raise your hand. I'll see it. Jeff, closing comments from you.
Sure, and I regret that I'm not on camera. I'm on the speaker in my car. I had to do one of those practical things that I've been talking about. I am a dad, so I had to leave to go get my daughter from school. So that's what I'm doing right now. But this has been outstanding. I really appreciate Adam so very much, and for all that he's shared with us today. Excited about his new book that has come out, and I want to urge you, if you don't have a copy of his book, to please get at a supper time. We want to invite, as we were inviting Adam, he was also releasing his book, and A More Perfect Union, right? And so so this was already in the queue. We'll have him another time to come and share with us out of his recently published work, but I hope you will, in the meantime, get a copy if you don't have it. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to do this monthly. We've sort of gotten away from it, but we're going to return to it because we see the need for ongoing conversation. Thank you, Lisa, for facilitating the conversation today.
Absolutely. And I'm calling on my brother, Salvador. Okay, thank you. Salvador has agreed to close us with prayer today. And yes, the conversation will continue. You'll get information, invitation for that. And as Jeff has said, that our intention is for us to meet monthly. Bless you. Thank you, Salvador.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this opportunity to get together and talk about our country, the challenges that we are facing, but also we bring hope to the table because you are bigger than the United States of America, and you are not only the God of America or the United States of America, but you are the God of the whole world. And thank you for your son, Jesus, who came to this world to incarnate, to live among us, to die for us, for every human being around the earth. Lord, give us a big vision to see the whole world, to see the whole family, and bring peace and bring justice for all around the world. Thank you for every person connected at this time. Thank you for their ministries. Thank you for their presence in their communities. And we ask you that you bless us, guide us, and grant us wisdom to continue doing the ministry for what you are called us. We pray in Jesus, our Savior, our prophet. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Salvador. As you leave the call and as the meeting is closed, you will receive an evaluation. And so we ask that you will please take time to respond to that. Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Felicia. Appreciate it. Andre,